on the highway here.
What? I was in the car when I saw you.
Hi, my name is Jorge Lucero. I am an artist and a professor of art education at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate in this symposium. It was my hope from the invitation to actually be able to come to Amsterdam and deliver this talk in person. But as is the case with so much of the work that I do and so much of, I'm sure, what you all do, it was impossible for me to get away from here. What tends to happen when the parameters get tightened, something new emerges. I would like to highlight the point of how this work gets done within the middle spaces of living. You know, I don't really see a difference between a sketch and a finished work. In many ways, I feel that, you know, the sketch, like the attempt, is just as worthy as something that's finished. And then it turns out that that's the thing that actually carries some force, some energy, some intensity. What happens when the parameters of life put a squeeze on your mode of working? So, you know, life has occurred. I'm married, I have children, I worked as a Chicago public school teacher for many years. They start to sort of encase your time. And that doesn't really allow for a lot of long periods of studio creation. But I started looking at other examples of the way that people were making work. Conceptual art is artworks that are made, that foreground the idea over the actual object, whatever the object is. Because I think in many ways, for a lot of teachers, the most frustrating thing is to feel like you were a part of that discourse, but then you were not able to do that anymore because of time restrictions and other kinds of responsibilities, including the responsibility to make money, which is a real thing. It's a thing that you have to do in order to sustain your work. The other thing that allows you to make more work is a reconceptualization of your definitions of what that work is. But if the definition can be either broadened or expanded, then you can actually reconceptualize the way that you do your work and continue to make it within those new parameters. Then the question is, what are the new forms, the new ways of working? This is a way for me that works of conceptual art open up the possibilities for what could happen in the classroom. And what I mean is, I don't really mean in terms of what you could do with your students. That work that you're doing with your students is really just a reason to come together. The education of your students happens very strongly by the media that they consume. And, you know, we just get a small part. Ivan Illich would call it conviviality, right? Which is a word that breaks down into living near each other. Then you have to figure out how this is a creative work for you. So I've thought a lot about what artists do, and the thing that I've arrived to is that most artists practice in something called pliability. Pliability means the ability to bend. I think if you look at what artists do, this is mostly what they do. So if what the contemporary artist is tasked with, why not think about things that seem unpliable as pliable? And I would start with, we find ourselves in schools, we find ourselves around administrators, we find ourselves in relational situations, we find ourselves having to play the authority figure. We find ourselves having to advocate for our field, for the worth of our subject of study. We find ourselves asking for money. We find ourselves fighting the good political fight of what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a laborer in this way, what it means to be a public intellectual. These are the places that we find ourselves as a teacher. So I'm not really talking about the craft of being a teacher. I'm not talking about the art of teaching. I'm talking about teaching as art practice. If we're thinking about art as exercises in pliability, then it seems almost obvious. It's a material. It's a kind of material. That's our job, right? Our job as artists within the classroom is to take those things that seem uninteresting and test them for pliability. It is the artist's role to be someone who's testing pliability. Pick your material, think about what you want to say through that material, bend it, push it, stretch it, try to fold it as many times over as you can. And then the second thing is look at your results. What do you have left? And then to take whatever's edited and put it into the world somehow and try to see if you can have a conversation about it. You have a job, you can work, and you can think through your work into your creative practice, the tasks that you have to undertake as part of your responsibilities as an employee of that school, that some of those tasks can become your work. And it's not like symbolic work. Sometimes it's just the thing in and of itself. And again, it's just like working and then seeing what you keep. Working and then seeing what you keep. The point is to work, though. Right? The point is to not get yourself so bent out of shape because you don't have the luxuries that you used to have at one point in your life to make work, and you are now faced with some very strict parameters that you just can't seem to overcome because you feel like the work can only be made or should only be made in this one way. There's that great Andy Warhol quote, "Don't cry, work." Just get to work, figure out what the parameters are, figure out what the material is, and then test the pliability of that material. I'll give you one example of something that actually happened in the classroom when I was a high school teacher. I had a group of students they were freshmen. It was their first year of high school, so they were all about 14 years old. There was about 25 students in the class. And they were very talkative. I mean, not in a terrible way. They were just, they weren't disruptive. They were just chatty. They loved to talk to each other. And, basically what it did was it created a certain kind of slowness in the work that they were doing, which in and of itself wasn't so bad, except for the fact that I wanted to get a certain amount of things done with them before the semester ended. So it's not really my instinct to tell students that they can't talk while they make art. As a matter of fact, I love it. I loved it that my students were able to do that. But this was kind of getting out of hand, and we were not moving at the pace that I wanted us to be moving along. I thought about it for a few days, and I decided that one of the parameters was my anxiety about telling them to stop talking. And so what would I do with that? And, I turned it on its head, and I thought, well, probably the best thing that I could do is analyze what talking is as a way of making work, too. So how is talking a material? But more than anything, what I was really interested in was what were some of the properties of talking that could actually leverage a certain kind of work that would actually be enhanced because of the properties of having a conversation. And at the time, I had recently seen a documentary where the painter Chuck Close, was talking about interruptions into his work process. He was talking about when he was painting, he could easily come back to the painting if he was interrupted, or if he had to go to lunch, or if he had to meet with somebody who came to the studio, he could easily come back and just pick up exactly where he left off. And part of that was because of the way that he set up his system of working. If you're familiar with the span of Chuck Close's work, you'll notice that at a certain point he was making photorealistic paintings, and then he stopped making those kinds of paintings, or he started to make paintings that where he was gridding the portrait and just taking whatever information was in each of the individual squares of the grid and translating those into tiny little abstractions that when you moved away from the painting you could actually see the portrait. So in essence what he was doing was he was doing a type of quilting, and this is actually the method that he referred to point to the solution of how he was able to come back to the work even after going away from the work. Chuck Close was pointing to quilting as social practice, as something that you could do while you were talking, while you were having a conversation, that you could put it down for a moment, go and take care of some of the tasks in the house or on the farm, and then come back to the quilting exactly where you left off. The work could be done despite the demands of everyday life. So, what I understood talking in the classroom as a demand of everyday life that was sort of begging to be included in the process of what was happening in the classroom. I came into the classroom one day and I presented an idea to the students, which was that we would make a 3-week work, and the work would be called Eating, Talking, and Watching TV. I became very interested in what did it mean to intrude on the everyday practice of the studio with the work of life. And I asked the class who knew how to knit. And it turns out half of the class knew how to knit. I didn't know how to knit. Um, and I bought a lot of yarn and some knitting needles. And we brought in an artist who I knew incorporated knitting into their work. And she came in, she did a demonstration, and she also talked about her own knitting practices. And then what we did was we proceeded to spend the next 3 weeks of class eating, talking, and watching television. Students brought in their favorite television shows. We were bringing snacks in all the time into class, and we were encouraging each other to have conversations, to be social in the class. Uh, the only rule, if you want to call it a rule, besides those 3 parameters of eating, watching television, and talking, was that at the whole time you had to be knitting. So you could be snacking and you could be watching television and you could be talking, but you had to, as much as possible, continue to knit. And the question wasn't so much about what you were making, but just that you were registering time with the knitting. What I was most interested in them doing was in them uh, keeping time with the knitting that they were doing. The students made a bunch of different forms. Some of them had better expertise than others. Some of them got better as the process went along, but the mastery of the knitting was kind of irrelevant, actually. Every single piece of knitted fabric was kept as a record of time passing. I was actually supposed to be teaching them painting. But in the end, because I was supposed to be teaching them painting, we ended up using all of the knitting, all of the patches of fabric that we essentially made with the knitting as color swatches to talk about how painting could be thought of today. And we installed everything that we made onto one of the walls in the school, and essentially creating a large mural of swatches of fabric. And because some of the threading on the knitting was coming off of the sides of the fabric, what ended up happening was you ended up getting this effect of like dripping paint. And so we could talk about abstraction, we were able to talk about composition, we talked about installation, we talked about the history of painting coming and going in the context of all the other art that gets made, and painting's perpetual battle with its own demise. And these were freshmen. These were students who I was trying to begin a conversation not only about what was possible in art because of what they had experienced before, but what was possible in art because of what they brought to the classroom, what I brought to the classroom, and how that combination of expertise and blind spots. And the question was, how do we bring those together so that we could coexist in this space and actually create the moment together? For me, that's just one example of how in my classroom, through my teaching practice, I get to experience not only the task of communicating with young people, and by communicating I mean them educating me educating them, hopefully in some way, but also trying to figure out how to live that moment together, how to make that moment pliable together, how to figure out a way that the time that we're together in that building, and sometimes it's in my classroom, sometimes it's outside of my classroom, but the time that we're in that building together, that we're able to make a more fruitful experience, that we're able to make a richer lived experience, and something that we could really hold on to. Conceptual art is usually marked by its ephemerality, and schooling is traditionally marked by its ability to delineate and mark out achievements. At the same time, one of the key properties of conceptual art is the work narrative, the story that accompanies how the work was made, how it was brought into existence, and how it's been deployed or how it has survived beyond the initial moment of existence. That's not unlike what happens in the classroom. I think that the teacher, as conceptual artist, recognizes that the activity that is happening in the room is important. The process is important. The object or objects that are being made are important because of how they're being engaged. And the work narrative that survives from the moment of learning, the moment of making, is perhaps the single most important aspect of the work that the students take with them, that the teacher takes with them, and that can be used to represent in an insufficient way it can be used to represent temporarily only something that is in its essence impossible to represent, and that is the complexity of living, the affect of a particular passage of time, and maybe in the most generous moment, a quality education.